The beginning in a small town in 1995. The story begins in the quiet suburban area of Portland, Oregon, where life was typically peaceful, and neighbors recognized each other by first name. It was a frosty January evening in 1995, the streets dimly lit by soft yellow streetlights, and most people had retreated indoors to escape the cold. At a local family-owned restaurant on the outskirts of town, business was winding down for the evening. Only 2 employees remained, dutifully balancing the register as they prepared to close shop. Suddenly, the tranquility of the night shattered like a dropped glass. A gang of masked intruders stormed into the establishment, heavily armed and shockingly organized. The 2 employees, both in their 20s, were instantly subdued, hands bound with zip ties and forced at gunpoint to unlock the restaurant's safe. They complied, thinking that surviving the ordeal was worth more than any amount of cash. But what happened next was anything but a routine robbery. Instead of taking the money and leaving, the group coldly executed the victims. This act of violence wasn't about the few $1,000s in the safe, it was something more sinister, a statement of domination. The gang meticulously wiped down surfaces, erasing any fingerprints or identifiable traces, leaving the crime scene almost sterile in its precision. When the bodies were discovered early the next morning, the community was shaken to its core. This kind of brutality was unheard of in their usually serene neighborhood. As investigators arrived, the sheer calculated manner of the crime left them unnerved. The forensic team found few leads. No DNA, no footprints, only the eerie belief that this particular crime was not an isolated act. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was this the work of a professional heist crew? A revenge hit gone wrong, or something even more chilling? Law enforcement officers, already burdened with limited resources, were about to uncover the beginning threads of what would become one of America's most notorious crime waves. This wasn't just a simple robbery, it marked the first step in a sprawling narrative intertwining terror, strategy, and a calculated disregard for human life. A string of mysterious disappearances. In the 2 years following the chilling events of 1995, an unsettling pattern began to emerge across the western states of Oregon, Washington, and California. It started slowly, just a few individual cases of missing persons that barely registered on the public radar. A mechanic heading home from work never made it to his quiet suburban house. A young couple on a road trip vanished somewhere between Seattle and Portland, their car abandoned on a desolate stretch of highway. But as the months went by, these isolated cases accumulated into a broader, far more disturbing picture. By mid-1996, law enforcement agencies noticed a sharp uptick in disappearances. In small towns and rural areas, people began to talk. Families whispered about loved ones who had seemingly evaporated into thin air, and neighborhoods buzzed with rumors about vans seen loitering suspiciously late at night. The growing collection of missing persons cases stretched across state lines, yet the precise connection between these incidents remained maddeningly elusive. For detectives, it was like chasing ghosts. Victims appeared to vanish without a trace, no signs of struggle, no significant evidence left behind. Vehicles tied to missing individuals were often found miles from their last known location, wiped clean of prints or personal items, almost as if they were bait purposefully left to deepen the sense of despair. In one case, a retired teacher from Salem, Oregon, had gone out for a morning walk. Her shoes were discovered neatly placed near a forest trail, but no other clues ever emerged as to what might have happened to her. As the mystery deepened, a small task force assembled to analyze the growing number of cases. Investigators soon began to identify eerie similarities in the disappearances. Most victims were last seen late at night, often in isolated areas or on long stretches of highways. Several were traveling alone or in pairs, and their missing vehicles only added to the puzzle. It became disturbingly clear that this wasn't random misfortune or run-of-the-mill criminal activity. This was organized, deliberate, and chillingly efficient. Newspapers began reporting on the possibility of a serial kidnapper, or worse, a network, operating in the region. Headlines screamed warnings about venturing out at night or trusting strangers in desolate areas. Yet, for all the media frenzy, frustrations mounted within law enforcement. Evidence continued to be scarce, leaving families in agonizing limbo, desperate for answers that investigators simply couldn't provide. Speculation gripped the community. Could this be the work of a human trafficking ring, or perhaps a cult? Or was it the twisted handiwork of a highly skilled, methodical criminal operation? The FBI was eventually drawn into the case, poring over missing persons reports and consulting behavioral analysts. But even their expertise struggled to crack the case. As 1997 approached, the disappearances didn't just persist, they escalated. Entire families and groups began vanishing while traveling. One particularly haunting instance involved 3 construction workers from San Jose, California, who had carpooled to a job site but never returned home. Their work van was discovered abandoned and torched in an industrial park 2 counties away. With suspicions mounting, law enforcement began cross-referencing the disappearances with other potential crimes in the area. Local police departments found themselves deeply out of their depth as clues remained sparse. As the list of missing persons grew longer, it became clear that the western United States was facing a shadowy predator unlike anything it had ever encountered before. Highway murders. The crime wave reached an even more horrifying level when a family of 4 traveling southbound on Interstate 5, the lifeblood highway connecting the entire West Coast, vanished under suspicious circumstances. The family, consisting of a young couple and their 2 children, had been returning home to Sacramento after spending the holidays with relatives in Seattle. The Andersons were last seen stopping at a roadside diner around 9 p.m. before continuing their long overnight drive. What happened next solidified their case as one of the most tragic in this chain of events. Witnesses later reported seeing a dark, unmarked van tailing the family's sedan for several miles. Some said the van's headlights flickered multiple times, almost as if signaling the other vehicle. The Andersons' car eventually slowed down, apparently pulling over to the side of the highway. Whether they stopped voluntarily or were coerced remains a mystery, but what is certain is that this stop marked the end of their journey. Days later, their vehicle was discovered deep in a dense forest off a remote access road several miles from the main highway. The car was charred beyond recognition, a smoldering shell surrounded by the dark silence of the wilderness. Nearby, the bodies of all 4 family members were found scattered and partially buried under leaves and debris, not simply victims of an accident but of outright murder. Authorities later confirmed that each member of the family had been shot multiple times, execution style. In an especially chilling detail, evidence suggested that the parents had been forced to watch as their 2 young children were killed before their own lives were taken. The investigation surrounding the case was fraught with dead ends. At the diner where the family had last been spotted, witnesses remembered them being in good spirits, with no sign of being followed. Surveillance cameras along I-5 offered no clear view of the vehicles involved, and extensive searches of the surrounding forest yielded no clues. No shell casings, no tire tracks, no items belonging to the family other than the burned-out car itself. The scene looked horrifyingly deliberate, as though someone, or a group, went to great lengths to erase their tracks. As news of this heinous act spread, panic overtook the communities along Interstate 5. This was no longer a case of sporadic disappearances or random acts of violence. This was targeted, premeditated murder. Family road trips, a common tradition for many Americans, suddenly felt fraught with danger. People started traveling in caravans, avoiding nighttime drives, and refusing to stop on deserted stretches of road. The once bustling rest stops now resembled ghost towns by sundown, filled with an eerie stillness as fear gripped anyone setting out on long-distance journeys. Media coverage dubbed the tragedy the I-5 massacre, and theories about the culprits ran wild. Some speculated that it was the work of a rogue gang using the highway network for their crimes. Others believed this might be the work of a psychopath preying on vulnerable travelers. But the most haunting theory came from law enforcement. This was not random. The precision of the attacks, the lack of evidence at the scene, and the vanishing act by the perpetrators indicated an operation far more calculated. Forensic teams, including experts brought in from the FBI, dug through what little evidence they had. There were faint traces of burned cloth and melted fragments of plastic that could have belonged to restraints. Some of these artifacts hinted at a level of brutality almost ritualistic in nature. Investigators pieced together a grim scenario. The Anderson family had likely been stopped, detained, and transported in the unmarked van before being killed. The carefully staged destruction of the crime scene only added another layer of mystery. The case left the Anderson family's relatives and the entire region grappling with overwhelming grief and fear. How could an ordinary road trip become the setting for such unspeakable evil? The I-5 corridor was no longer just a major travel artery, it had become synonymous with danger, despair, and death. Despite the best efforts of local police and federal agents, the case remained unsolved for months. Then, a chilling connection came to light. The pattern of murders and disappearances along the western United States bore enough similarities that investigators began piecing them together like a puzzle. The Andersons weren't the only family to have vanished along the I-5 corridor. While no solid suspects emerged, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning of a reign of terror that would grip the country for years to come. The Young Widow and the Horror of 1997. By 1997, the still unfolding nightmare that had crept across the western United States claimed yet another victim in one of its most haunting cases, this time striking the very heart of San Francisco. Jennifer Wallace, a 32-year-old mother of two, was leading what many would describe as a modest but happy life. With her husband David working at a local warehouse and her two small children attending a nearby elementary school, the Wallaces were a picture of a young family finding their way in one of America's busiest cities. But one late evening in April 1997, their lives were changed forever. That night, Jennifer was home alone with her children in their modest two-bedroom apartment. David had gone to run a quick errand and promised to return within the hour. Jennifer had just tucked her kids into bed and was preparing to relax in front of the TV when there was a sudden knock at the front door. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man dressed in what appeared to be a police officer's uniform. "Ma'am, sorry to disturb you at this hour," he said in a calm, authoritative tone. "It's a routine call. There's been a report of a break-in in the area, and I just need to ask you a few questions." Feeling reassured by his professional demeanor, Jennifer unlocked the door. What followed, however, was a descent into a living nightmare. The man forced his way inside, revealing his true intentions as he grabbed Jennifer and bound her hands with zip ties. Her screams startled her children, who came running into the room, only to be ordered at gunpoint to sit on the couch. The intruder turned the once cozy family apartment into a scene of terror. Ransacking drawers and cabinets, he demanded money, jewelry, and anything of value. Jennifer, desperate to protect her children, complied with every command, handing over her family's meager possessions, including her wedding ring. But this wasn't just a robbery. His actions were deliberate, calculated, and dripping with menace. His eyes betrayed no remorse, only a cold resolve to instill fear. When David returned home shortly after, the situation took a horrifying turn. Seeing his wife and children being held hostage, he tried to reason with the intruder, offering his own life in exchange for their safety. The man momentarily agreed, forcing David into a corner while keeping the gun pointed at Jennifer and the children. But the hope of resolution was fleeting. Without warning, the stranger fired, first at David, who collapsed instantly, and then at Jennifer. The children, too young to fully comprehend what was happening, cried for their parents, but were spared. What should have been a haven for a growing family became the site of a tragedy that would haunt the community and make headlines nationwide. A neighbor, alarmed by the gunshots, called the police, but by the time officers arrived, the assailant was gone. He had fled the scene in the family's sedan, taking with him the stolen valuables, leaving two children orphaned and a neighborhood forever scarred by the violence that had unfolded. The investigation into the crime ignited a firestorm. Eyewitness testimonies described the suspect as a man in his late 30s, clean-shaven with dark hair, and wearing what appeared to be a police uniform. For the first time, there was a consistent and clear description of the perpetrator linked to the string of violent crimes sweeping the region. The case brought forth chilling suspicions. Was the man a part of law enforcement, or was he merely impersonating an officer to gain the trust of his victims? Media outlets dubbed him the Phantom Cop, and his method of hiding in plain sight sent ripples of paranoia through communities. Trust in authority was eroded as parents warned children to never open the door, no matter who was on the other side. In neighborhoods across the West Coast, people began blatantly questioning anyone claiming to represent law enforcement. Some even demanded identification from uniformed officers, a behavior unheard of before this reign of terror. Jennifer Wallace's story, published and retold in newspapers from coast to coast, symbolized the widespread fear and heartbreak caused by this elusive criminal or group of criminals. Her courage in the face of savagery and her husband's ultimate sacrifice made them both symbols of resistance and loss. Candlelight vigils were held in their honor, complete with tearful speeches and community pledges to watch out for one another. However, the glaring question remained unanswered: who was this man, and why was he doing this? As authorities sifted through the debris of evidence left behind, one thing became painfully apparent. The individual or individuals behind these crimes was methodical, imaginative, and terrifyingly meticulous. The Wallace tragedy wasn't isolated, and it would not be the last. The unveiling of a sophisticated criminal network. As law enforcement struggled to untangle the web of heinous crimes spreading across the western United States, a chilling realization began to set in. This wasn't the work of a single individual. The patterns of violence, precise execution, and utter lack of evidence at crime scenes pointed to something far more sinister, an organized and highly sophisticated criminal network operating under the radar. The turning point came after investigators revisited old cases, piecing together a string of crimes that had once seemed unrelated. There was a thread tying them together, reports of perpetrators impersonating law enforcement, using tactical precision, and leaving little more than devastation in their wake. The notion that these acts were random crumbled as forensic psychologists and experienced criminal profilers joined the effort to seek answers. A far more calculated plan began to emerge, a plan devised by a group of highly skilled individuals determined to operate in a space where fear and chaos would shield them. At the center of this criminal organization was a strategy unmatched in its ingenuity. The group chose targets meticulously: families driving long stretches on desolate highways, small businesses in remote areas, or unsuspecting victims alone in their homes. Among their most chilling techniques was the use of disguises. Posing as police officers, first responders, or even utility workers. These ruses allowed them to disarm their marks, both literally and figuratively. Victims felt compelled to comply, giving the group a psychological and tactical advantage. The gang's operations followed a methodical playbook. Members would conduct weeks of surveillance on their targeted areas. They studied routines, noted times when homes were left unattended, and mapped escape routes to avoid being tracked. Their impersonations were chillingly convincing, right down to the fake badges, uniforms, and carefully rehearsed lines. It was their attention to detail that made the group so elusive, leaving victims, with their guards down, vulnerable to devastating consequences. What set this gang apart wasn't just their cunning, it was their sheer ruthlessness. No loose ends were left alive. Witnesses were eliminated without hesitation, and crime scenes were sanitized as if the perpetrators had rehearsed every move. Fingerprints and DNA were expertly wiped away, and any physical evidence was either obliterated or misleading, leaving investigators grappling with dead ends. One particularly harrowing discovery involved the zip ties frequently used to restrain victims. Investigators found that the ties were purchased in bulk from multiple states, making it nearly impossible to track down their source. Even their vehicles, frequently described as unmarked vans, were often stolen and later found abandoned, burned to ash, leaving no trace of who had been inside. By the time law enforcement began to put the pieces together, the trail was already cold. Analysts theorized that this was not a random assembly of petty criminals, but a meticulously hierarchical group operating with military precision. The methods employed, strategic ambushes, extraction of valuables with efficiency, and execution with such chilling finality, suggested prior experience in disciplines that demanded a high level of control. Former military personnel, special forces operatives, or highly trained mercenaries immediately became suspects in profiles built by the FBI. What made this group even more unsettling was their adaptability. The gang didn't rely on a single modus operandi. While some crimes involved apparent armed robberies, others seemed designed purely to instill fear and hopelessness, like targeting entire families traveling on highways or ambushing police patrols in isolated areas. This versatility made the group unpredictable and that much harder to corner. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of their operation was their use of technology. Law enforcement discovered that during some of their crimes, the gang had exploited police radio frequencies, intercepting communications to stay one step ahead of authorities. In other cases, cell phone towers in specific regions were disrupted long enough to disable victims from calling for help. These tactics suggested someone within the gang had intimate knowledge of law enforcement protocols and advanced technology, either through training or experience. The media quickly picked up on the emerging portrait of this group, dubbing them the Shadow Network. Fear escalated as details of their deceptive practices and their astounding ability to evade capture trickled out. For the public, it wasn't just the gruesome crimes that rattled them, it was the insidious thought that the gang could be hiding in plain sight. Could the person knocking on a door in uniform be there to help, or could he be there to kill? As the FBI continued their investigation, they theorized that whoever was masterminding this network had a deep, personal motive. The crimes appeared calculated, systemic, and motivated not by greed alone, but by an almost pathological need to assert control and instill fear. Someone had created this machine of violence and terror, but who? The answers soon began to take shape. Reports started surfacing of a man named Michael Colson, a disgruntled and highly skilled ex-Marine who had been discharged under ambiguous circumstances. Known to harbor anger toward the government and authority figures, Colson had reportedly developed a small following of equally alienated former servicemen. Using the skills they had learned in the military, combative tactics, precision planning, and psychological manipulation, Colson and his followers wouldn't just commit crimes, they sought to create havoc that would undermine public trust in institutions like law enforcement. In hindsight, the emergence of this group showcased an unsettling reality. It wasn't just brute force or clever disguises that allowed them to thrive, it was an exploitation of trust. They thrived in the cracks of society's systems, slipping past defenses because they knew exactly how those systems functioned. This was no ordinary gang. This was the birth of a criminal network meticulously designed to outsmart and outmaneuver both its victims and those tasked with stopping it. The Shadow Network had pulled back the veil on their operation, and the revelations that followed would not only change the course of law enforcement tactics, but also plunge the country deeper into fear. The Denver ambush of 1998. In November of 1998, the mile-high city, known for its serene mountain vistas and bustling urban energy, was thrust into horror and chaos after one of the most brazen and brutal ambushes in law enforcement history. The Denver ambush, as it came to be known, didn't just shatter lives, it shook the very foundation of trust between civilians and institutions meant to protect them. The dark events of that frosty evening left the city reeling and squarely placed Denver in the web of terror spun by the infamous Shadow Network. It began like any other routine patrol for officers Greg Dawson and Tara Morales, assigned to the night shift in one of Denver's quieter residential districts. Both seasoned officers, Dawson and Morales, were no strangers to the occasional disturbance or petty crime, but otherwise, their corner of the city had a reputation for calm. On the night of November 14th, around 10:15 p.m., the two officers radioed in to report what appeared to be a disabled vehicle near the edge of an industrial park. A van, unmarked, with its hazard lights blinking. They had been trained to inspect suspicious vehicles like this one, a precaution against break-ins, thefts, or worse. Dashcam footage pulled from their patrol car later provided investigators with a haunting glimpse of the final moments before the ambush unfolded. As the officers approached the van, weapons holstered, the scene initially appeared harmless. The van's rear doors were slightly ajar, with no immediate signs of the driver. Officer Morales cautiously called out, her flashlight piercing the vehicle's shadows. That's when it happened. Within seconds, the patrol car itself became a death trap. Masked individuals emerged from the surrounding darkness, carrying incendiary devices and high-powered firearms. In a chillingly coordinated attack, smoke grenades were tossed under the patrol car and along the surrounding area, obscuring the scene and cutting off the officers from any chance of reinforcement. Dawson and Morales were locked inside their vehicle as the perpetrators barricaded the car doors from the outside. By the time backup arrived, neighbors had called 911 after hearing a series of muffled explosions. It was too late. The patrol car was fully engulfed in flames, with the charred remains of Dawson and Morales found inside when the fire was finally extinguished. An autopsy would later confirm what investigators feared most. The officers weren't killed by the initial fire. They had been alive when the flames consumed the vehicle, helpless to escape. The attackers had left behind no clues. The only weapon stolen from the scene was Dawson's service revolver, a choice that felt more like a calling card than a simple act of theft. Evidence suggested that the perpetrators vanished into the dense industrial park, scattering into the labyrinth of abandoned warehouses and dark alleyways, a perfect environment for staging an ambush. The murder of Dawson and Morales triggered immediate outrage and an unprecedented sense of vulnerability among Denver's law enforcement personnel. This was warfare, not mere violence. These killers hadn't just targeted officers of the law, they'd cornered them in the most savage way possible, sending a grim message to anyone who dared to stand in their way. National media descended upon Denver in the days following the attack, turning the spotlight on the escalating phenomenon of criminal groups using military-style ambush tactics to target civilians and police alike. Politicians and law enforcement officials delivered angry speeches vowing to bring the murderers to justice. But in reality, nobody had answers. The flames consumed more than just lives and evidence, they also ignited fear that practically debilitated the city's operations. "What we're dealing with here is a new kind of evil," said Chief Albert Forsyth in a press conference held just days after the attack. "The kind that plans every step carefully, executes with no emotion, and leaves nothing but ashes behind." The fateful Denver ambush not only derailed the lives of two heroic officers but also underscored the terrifying precision of the criminal organization at work. Investigators were baffled by the lack of physical evidence at the scene. The perpetrators appeared to have rehearsed every move. From the use of smoke grenades to obscure dashcam footage, to the speed and efficiency with which they barricaded the patrol car, it was clear that this crime wasn't an impulsive attack, but a carefully staged act of terror. Above all, one chilling realization haunted investigators. This was personal. From the viciousness of their methods to the intentional targeting of law enforcement, the perpetrators were sending a message meant to echo far beyond Denver. And it did. News of the Denver ambush spread rapidly through national headlines, leaving communities across the United States grappling with the unthinkable. If organized killers could take down two highly trained officers in their own patrol car, what hope did anyone else have against such calculated brutality? Forensic teams eventually linked small details of the Denver ambush to other crimes attributed to the Shadow Network, strengthening suspicions that the group's hierarchy included individuals with military experience. The use of incendiary devices, the precision of their movements, and even the symbolic theft of Dawson's sidearms suggested the work of trained professionals. This wasn't the recklessness of a lone criminal, it was the cold, measured strike of a well-coordinated unit. The families of both officers became central figures in Denver's grieving community. Memorials were held in their honor, with thousands of mourners lining the streets to pay tribute to lives cut tragically short. Dawson's widow, Melissa, spoke to reporters at one of the vigils, her voice shaking but resolute. "They didn't just take Greg," she said, clutching a photo of her late husband and their 3-year-old daughter. "They took a piece of this entire city, but they won't take our fight. He believed in justice, and so do I." The Denver ambush wasn't just another crime to investigate. It was a battle that marked a decisive moment in the war against the Shadow Network. Although justice remained elusive in the immediate aftermath, one thing became increasingly clear: the game had changed. Professional killers, or former military operatives? By late 1998, law enforcement had reached a critical juncture. The wave of murders, disappearances, and brazen attacks across the western United States pointed to an undeniable conclusion. This was no ordinary criminal group. The Shadow Network, as it came to be known, had operated with shocking precision, leaving nearly no tangible evidence behind. Their ability to evade detection, outmaneuver law enforcement, and meticulously plan their crimes begged the question, exactly who were these people? It wasn't long before a theory began to take form, a theory that would cast a chilling shadow over the entire investigation. The level of skill demonstrated by the group suggested tactical knowledge that went far beyond the capacity of common criminals. Their ambush scenarios, logistical organization, and even their calculated use of fear and misdirection were disturbingly reminiscent of military training. Could the Shadow Network be orchestrated by former military personnel, or even disillusioned specialists in fields like law enforcement or private security? This disturbing possibility set federal agencies into motion, scouring through a mountain of public and classified records. Everything from military discharge files to private contracting firms came under scrutiny. Investigators sought any pattern of behavior or connections that might link former service members to violent criminal enterprises. The focus of their search wasn't random. Previous incidents had left behind small, telling breadcrumbs. One of the first clues came from the escape techniques used in multiple crime scenes. In the Denver ambush, for instance, tactical-grade smoke grenades had been detonated in a manner similar to what would be deployed during military-style diversionary maneuvers. Smoke grenades weren't just chosen for chaos, they were deliberately used to disorient the victims, obscure visibility, and mask any chance of identifying the perpetrators. It was a detail that struck former military analysts consulted by the FBI. "This isn't luck," one former Navy SEAL advisor in the investigation stated. "These guys know exactly what they're doing. Every second of this is planned." Moreover, the Shadow Network's efficiency in avoiding pursuit was alarming. Getaway vehicles were often burned or abandoned in remote areas with key evidence destroyed. Routes of escape were always chosen to overlap with poorly surveilled regions, including backroads and vacant industrial sites. In multiple cases, the methodology of dispersing and regrouping after an ambush mirrored clandestine military unit strategies. These weren't random escapes. They were exceptionally disciplined approaches honed by personnel familiar with evading capture. Forensic analysis on crime scenes further bolstered the suspicion of military involvement. The zip ties used to bind victims were purchased in bulk from several states, a deliberate move to avoid a traceable point of sale. Investigators also noted the brazen refusal to leave DNA or chemical evidence. The perpetrators understood how crime labs worked and dismantled any chance of being identified before they struck. To many in law enforcement, this suggested technical expertise that could come from individuals with past experience in highly secure environments, individuals trained to both cover and erase their tracks. Another bone-chilling discovery came in their choice of weapons. The Shadow Network employed equipment that ranged from standard firearms to more specialized tools of lethality. Hollow-point ammunition was frequently recovered in the aftermath of shootings, a sobering reminder that their attacks were designed to kill with maximum effectiveness. And while city jurisdictions scrambled to keep pace with the rise in complexity, federal agencies were already assembling profiles of suspects who might be capable of executing such acts. One profile stood out. The central hypothesis pointed to intelligent, organized individuals with advanced training in strategy, combat, and logistics. The theory wasn't baseless. In the United States, thousands of former military personnel transitioned into civilian life every year. While the overwhelming majority went on to lead lawful lives, a small percentage of them carried deep grievances against the government, authority figures, or society itself. For those who failed to adjust post-service, these pent-up frustrations could manifest dangerously. Resentment and trauma could easily snowball into destructive outlets, particularly when paired with a unique skill set that included weapons handling, manipulation, and psychological warfare. And then there was the leader. The Shadow Network clearly operated under centralized hierarchical leadership. Orders were being issued, resources allocated, and targets selected with an unyielding efficiency that implied someone at the helm had a vision and a vendetta. The FBI began zeroing in on records of ex-servicemen discharged from elite branches under questionable circumstances. Scores of names were flagged, but one eventually stood out: Michael Colson. Michael Colson, an ex-Marine, had been honorably discharged despite a string of disciplinary issues throughout his military career. Known among peers as both brilliant and temperamental, Colson had reportedly served time overseas where he developed expertise in tactical planning and logistics. However, after an altercation with superior officers and rumored psychological evaluations that flagged anger management issues, Colson had found himself at odds with the very institution he once served. Once discharged, his attempts to integrate into civilian life were rocky at best. Multiple rejections from private sector jobs fueled a deep resentment he harbored toward authority figures. Neighbors described him as reclusive, bitter, and meticulous. Further digging into Colson's history uncovered chilling relationships. He had maintained contact with a small fraternity of similarly disillusioned former military members, men who had either been discharged for dubious reasons or who felt alienated after their service. Together, they formed a network united by shared anger and unparalleled tactical expertise. Their motivations appeared to blur the line between greed and ideology. Some theorists suggested they weren't just criminals, they were insurgents acting on a warped justification, seeking to dismantle systems of order and trust in society. For investigators, Colson was far from a lone wolf. He represented a potent and dangerous archetype, a man once trained to protect, now using that training to wage war on the very principles he was sworn to defend. As more details of his life came into focus, the case against Colson deepened. If the Shadow Network wasn't his creation, he was certainly one of its architects. By early 1999, the theory of military involvement was no longer a question, but an inevitability. Photos of Colson and his network circulated within law enforcement circles, accompanied by warnings about their potential for further violence. The FBI profilers reiterated a grim truth to those working the case. This isn't random. These men aren't scared and they're not acting out of desperation. Their war has just started. The South California Motel Massacre of 1999. In the sweltering summer of 1999, South California was already grappling with a surge of crime and rising unrest. But the events that unfolded in a quiet, rundown motel on the outskirts of Los Angeles sent shockwaves through the region, solidifying the Shadow Network's terrifying reputation. Known locally as Desert Sun Motel, this modest establishment catered primarily to road-weary travelers, truck drivers, and low-budget tourists. On a sultry evening in late July, the motel became the scene of a massacre so gruesome that it would haunt investigators and locals alike for years to come. The motel's location made it a prime target, isolated just off a dusty highway, surrounded by nothing but barren desert terrain. On any given night it housed only a few guests, and July 22nd was no different. That evening, only 3 rooms were occupied: a business traveler en route to San Diego, an elderly couple driving across the state to visit family, and a long-haul trucker who frequently stopped at the motel during his cross-country routes. The lone motel manager, a middle-aged man named Frank Collins, was known for keeping to himself, managing the property alone and locking up promptly after sunset. By sunrise the next morning, all 5 individuals, guests and staff, were dead. The motel, once a mundane stop for travelers, now bore the chilling hallmarks of the Shadow Network's macabre expertise, the discovery. Everything seemed quiet until a family pulling into the motel for an early breakfast stumbled across the horrific scene. Instead of being greeted by the front desk manager, they found silence. Frank Collins, the manager, was discovered slumped behind the motel counter, shot execution style in the back of the head. The office safe had been emptied, but there were no signs of forced entry. As authorities arrived, they soon realized the devastation extended beyond the office. In the motel's dimly lit rooms, each of the guests had met a similarly grim fate. The business traveler's body was found in bed, his belongings rifled through and his wallet stripped of cash. The elderly couple's room was similarly ransacked, with both individuals seemingly executed while watching television, their cups of tea still positioned on the table. The trucker's body was discovered near the door of his room, leading investigators to believe he may have heard something and opened the door, only to find his killers waiting. Adding to the horror, the perpetrators had gone through extraordinary lengths to erase their presence. Doorknobs, counters, and surfaces were meticulously wiped clean of fingerprints. The motel's security camera system, a dated setup even for the time, had all its tapes removed. Even the crime scene itself bore the ominous signature of the Shadow Network: methodical, precise, and utterly ruthless. The hunt for clues law enforcement and federal agents descended upon the scene, scouring for any shred of evidence. Initially, the investigation ran into a frustrating dead end. The stolen safe offered no lead. It had been pried open and discarded some 30 miles away in a dumpster behind a gas station, scrubbed clean of any usable fingerprints or DNA. The victim's belongings were similarly devoid of clues. The only confirmed stolen items were cash and a few credit cards that had yet to be used. However, it was the sheer precision of the massacre, not the stolen goods, that left investigators unnerved. The killings weren't chaotic or rushed. Each victim had been subdued, their personal items systematically looted, and their lives taken without hesitation. The timeline suggested the perpetrators knew the motel's schedule, its layout, and how to carry out the crime swiftly without attracting attention. One chilling detail stood out: the use of silencers. No gunshots were reported by passing drivers or nearby residents, leading experts to conclude that the killers had used suppressed firearms, an uncommon choice for typical criminals, but a calculated tool perfect for a stealth mission. The psychological fallout. As news of the motel massacre spread, a cloud of dread descended upon the local community. Residents, already familiar with the Shadow Network's cryptic reputation, were now faced with the reality that nowhere, no matter how small or insignificant, was truly safe. Travelers passing through Southern California began avoiding roadside motels entirely, opting instead for larger, well-trafficked hotels with higher levels of security. Talk of a meticulously organized crime ring dominated the local news cycle. Forensic psychologists noted the emotional detachment of the killers, who seemed to remove human lives with as much precision and lack of hesitation as one would unload a grocery bag. These weren't ordinary thieves, they weren't desperate or unprepared, they were trained, methodical, and marked by a cold-blooded efficiency that left law enforcement grasping for answers. A connection to the Shadow Network. There were murmurs early on that the Desert Sun Motel killings bore all the hallmarks of the Shadow Network. The timeline aligned perfectly. Similarities to past crimes included the way the victims were restrained, the precise use of silenced weapons, and the total lack of incriminating evidence left behind. With each detail that emerged, it became increasingly clear. This wasn't the work of local amateurs or petty criminals. The FBI confirmed these suspicions weeks later when agents successfully retrieved a stolen credit card from one of the trucker's belongings that had been used at a pawn shop in Long Beach. Security footage from the shop captured two individuals selling off a gold necklace and wristwatch believed to have belonged to the elderly couple at the motel. Though both suspects wore masks, their body language and military-style coordination reignited the now familiar theory: former servicemen or highly trained operatives were involved. Fear takes root. The motel massacre forced local law enforcement to coordinate on an unprecedented level with federal agencies. What frightened authorities most was the random nature of the victims. Unlike other murders carried out by the Shadow Network, which often appeared to involve strategic targeting, families on highways, law enforcement officers, this particular set of killings seemed almost mercenary. The victims were strangers, ordinary people whose lives were snuffed out simply because they happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. This randomness only deepened the public's terror. It cemented the notion that the Shadow Network didn't operate with a single motive. Their crimes weren't just about money, revenge, or leverage. They were about keeping society at large paralyzed with fear. What it meant. The Desert Sun Motel became more than just a crime scene. It became a symbol of the chaos and uncertainty that blanketed the West Coast in the late 1990s. For many, it represented the loss of innocence, a grim reminder that even in a small, overlooked corner of America, evil could strike with terrifying precision. Law enforcement knew they were not just battling a criminal network but also fighting against time itself. The Shadow Network's ability to strike swiftly, erase their tracks, and vanish without a trace made every new crime a ticking clock for investigators. What else did this sinister group have in store? And how many more lives would be caught in their crosshairs before they were finally stopped? The cell phone murder breakthrough of 1999. By the summer of 1999, the Shadow Network was operating at full tilt, spreading fear and chaos across the western United States, leaving law enforcement perpetually one step behind. Dozens of open cases remained unsolved, with similarities in their execution: calculated precision, lack of evidence, and synchronized attacks, all pointing to the same elusive group. Desperation mounted as investigators struggled to find even a single solid lead, but it wasn't until a seemingly small mistake in June of 1999 that the first crack appeared in their impenetrable facade. The breakthrough began with a routine forensic review of stolen items from various crime scenes. One such item, a cell phone that had been taken from a victim in Oregon during a roadside abduction, suddenly came into focus. During the aftermath of the crime, the phone had remained missing, presumed destroyed or discarded, but in June 1999, authorities received an unexpected ping. The device had been reactivated and was sending a signal from the dense sprawl of San Jose, California. The cell phone's GPS technology wasn't advanced by today's standards. Back then, triangulation techniques were required to pinpoint its location. Still, the information was gold for investigators desperate for a breakthrough. Through a coordinated effort between local police and federal agents, the phone's movements were tracked in real time. The signal didn't lead to a quiet residential house or a landfill, as the investigators initially feared. Instead, it brought them to the bustling heart of San Jose, to a seedy pawn shop tucked between liquor stores and cash-checking facilities on a grimy downtown block. The phone had been marked for resale, and surveillance around the shop revealed faces that would soon become critical pieces in unraveling the Shadow Network's reign of terror. The arrest officers moved quickly and quietly, surrounding the pawn shop with plainclothes and uniformed personnel as they waited for the right moment. Inside, two men were mid-negotiation with the shop owner, attempting to sell not only the stolen cell phone but also several other items thought to have belonged to other murder victims. The shopkeeper, unaware of the item's sinister origins, seemed hesitant, likely trying to get a better price for the electronics. This delay worked in law enforcement's favor, giving them enough time to move in. Within moments, both men found themselves in handcuffs, shouting protests of innocence as they were dragged outside under bewildered stares from other customers. But these weren't ordinary criminals out to make a quick buck. They were directly tied to the string of brutal crimes attributed to the Shadow Network. Initial questioning proved frustrating. The suspects refused to provide meaningful details, claiming they had found the phone and other items discarded near a dumpster. But inconsistencies in their stories, combined with forensic evidence linking them to stolen goods, painted a much darker picture. Under mounting pressure, cracks began to show. Within days of their arrest, both men started revealing information that would blow the case wide open, connecting to the Shadow Network. The suspects, later identified as semi-low-ranking members of the Shadow Network, weren't the masterminds investigators had hoped to catch, but what they did offer were breadcrumbs that led to the network's inner workings. Neither man had been present at the Oregon murder from which the phone was originally stolen. Instead, they claimed they were responsible for cleaning up after the group's violent operations, disposing of stolen vehicles, scrubbing down crime scenes, and fencing valuables through pawn shops across multiple states. What truly alarmed law enforcement was the discipline and hierarchy described within the organization. These men answered to immediate superiors and knew only fragments of the bigger picture. However, both identified Michael Colson, a name already on the FBI's radar, as the suspected ringleader of the operation. Colson's leadership style reportedly mirrored that of a commanding officer overseeing a paramilitary unit. He issued orders through a tight chain of command, ensuring no single member had enough knowledge to betray the group entirely. Members of the Shadow Network were vetted not only for their loyalty but also for specific skill sets. Technical operators for electronic surveillance, logistics specialists, to analyze travel and evade detection, and, chillingly, enforcers trained to execute their orders with cold efficiency. An organization in flux. The suspects also hinted at something investigators had suspected but hadn't yet been able to confirm: the Shadow Network was expanding. What began as a small group of disillusioned veterans and career criminals under Colson's leadership had quickly grown into a vast operation spanning thousands of miles. New recruits were being inducted regularly, with training regimens designed to mimic military boot camps. The group's meticulous organization and expanding reach made them a far greater threat than investigators had even imagined. The cell phone itself became more significant as teams scoured its log files. Messages, carefully coded but painstakingly decoded later by FBI analysts, provided a deeper look into the network's operations. Communications referenced certain drop points, criminal exchanges, and, chillingly, the names of high-ranking members who had up until this point evaded capture. A domino effect. The impact of the arrests rippled far beyond San Jose. With the first tangible leads on the Shadow Network's operations now forming, law enforcement had their first real opportunity to infiltrate it from the bottom up. The suspects-turned-informants agreed to provide selective assistance in exchange for reduced sentences. Their information included locations of abandoned safe houses across California, caches of stolen goods stored in warehouses, and even the process by which Colson recruited new members. It became clear that the Shadow Network had long relied on its ability to drift through America's blind spots, the unmonitored backroads, the overlooked storage units in industrial zones, and a pawn shop economy more concerned with profit than suspicion. For years their anonymity was their greatest weapon, but now, for the first time, law enforcement agencies had an opportunity to turn that weapon against them. The shift in the battle against the Shadow Network. The arrests in San Jose marked a turning point in the hunt for Michael Colson and the dismantling of his empire. Law enforcement's growing understanding of the network's reach and organization created a clearer picture of what they were up against: a shadowy parallel world operating within the cracks of everyday society. More importantly, though, the cell phone found in 1999 proved that even the most calculated criminals are prone to human error. The Shadow Network's terrifying legacy wasn't just one of ruthlessness, it was also a demonstration of how arrogance and overconfidence, even in the darkest corners of organized crime, could lead to exposure. The Shadow Network unraveled, a leak cracks the empire. As 1999 wore on, the Shadow Network continued to operate with astonishing precision, leaving behind a trail of fear, death, and unanswered questions. Law enforcement across the western United States was still struggling to put the pieces together, unable to fully penetrate the group's meticulously held layers of secrecy. But even the most well-oiled criminal enterprises eventually show their cracks, and for the Shadow Network, the first major breach came not in the aftermath of a violent crime or a reckless ambush, but from within: a leak. For a group as disciplined and hierarchical as the Shadow Network, internal betrayal was unimaginable. Years of careful recruiting and paranoid layers of compartmentalization had shielded the group from infiltration. Members only knew enough to complete their assigned roles, and their operations were synchronized to prevent subordinates from seeing the bigger picture. Yet, as tensions within the organization rose and the stakes grew higher, one of their own began to unravel. A weak link in the chain. The leak originated with a man named Adrian Reyes, a low-ranking logistics operative who had only recently been brought into the network. Reyes had been recruited from the type of life the Shadow Network often preyed on, a dead-end existence rife with financial strain, criminal debt, and personal resentment. He offered little in the way of tactical skill but was valuable for his remarkable logistical knowledge of supply routes, shipping lanes, and the quieter corners of interstate transportation. Reyes had been assigned tasks such as coordinating the movement of vehicles, secure supply pickups, and arranging the disposal of stolen goods. These responsibilities gave him access to small but vital fragments of information about the broader operation. For the Shadow Network, Reyes was just another cog in the machine, easily replaceable should he fail to meet expectations. They didn't foresee the pressure Reyes was under, or how close he was to cracking. In his personal life, Reyes's world was falling apart. Mounting debts to violent loan sharks placed him in constant fear of retribution outside of the Shadow Network's structure. His involvement with the criminal network, which had seemed like a way out of his desperate circumstances, only plunged him deeper into a whirlpool of paranoia and regret. To make matters worse, Reyes was growing increasingly afraid of his superiors, particularly the deadly and enigmatic Michael Coulson. Reyes soon reached a breaking point. While handling a routine shipment of contraband weapons near a remote section of Arizona, he made a crucial mistake. He stopped to check a suspicious noise in his vehicle, exposing himself to the attention of a passing highway patrol car. Though Reyes talked his way out of the encounter, the close call left him shaken. He realized he wasn't cut out to shoulder the kind of pressure demanded by the Shadow Network. Worse, he knew his fear and unease would not go unnoticed. Within the group's ranks, hesitation wasn't forgiven. It was punished brutally. He became convinced that if he didn't act to protect himself, the network would eventually toss him aside or worse, eliminate him entirely. The decision to break in. Late 1999, driven by desperation and the belief he wouldn't make it out of the network alive, Reyes made the fateful decision to turn himself into law enforcement. But fully aware of the risks involved, he didn't walk into a precinct covered in cameras or saunter into his local FBI office. Instead, he arranged a clandestine meeting with federal agents, timed and located to ensure plausible deniability. Reyes initially played coy, claiming he had information about a dangerous operation in exchange for leniency on several warrants hanging over his head. FBI agents were skeptical at first, assuming that the man sitting in front of them was just another low-level criminal looking for a shortcut out of trouble. It wasn't until he began outlining details of the Shadow Network's methods, its recruitment strategies, chain of command, and shocking discipline, that the federal agents realized they might have stumbled onto the key to dismantling the criminal empire that had eluded them for years. Reyes was no mastermind, but he had seen enough to know that this operation was far larger and more organized than the FBI or local police had imagined. Spilling secrets. Reyes spilled what he knew in fits and starts. Fearful of retaliation, he refused to fully expose everything he held on the Shadow Network until he received assurance of protection. Initially, much of his knowledge seemed fragmented, disjointed pieces that didn't quite form a complete picture. Yet, the more Reyes spoke, the more agents began to connect dots they hadn't even realized were part of the same map. He revealed how new recruits were brought on through a combination of coercion and careful vetting. They targeted the disenfranchised, discharged military veterans angry at the system, debt-ridden laborers with no way out, small-time criminals looking to make a name for themselves. The network played on these weaknesses, offering a warped sense of belonging and purpose. Reyes described initiation tasks aimed at testing loyalty, from minor thefts to assisting in more sinister operations, with any dissenters quickly eliminated. Perhaps most alarmingly, Reyes laid bare the patchwork logistical network used by the group to move illicit goods across state lines. He described drop points disguised as failing storage units, vehicles switched out mid-route to avoid detection, and a network of shady contacts in the pawn shop and scrapyard underworld who helped launder stolen items for cash. One of the most pivotal revelations came when Reyes described their encrypted communication system. He exposed how the Shadow Network used disposable cell phones and coded language to issue orders. Each burn phone was discarded after a single operation, and messages were written using a cipher that only high-ranking members fully understood. This insight provided federal agents with their first real inroad into mapping the organizational structure of the network. And then, of course, there was the name Reyes dreaded to utter, Michael Coulson. Michael Coulson, the man behind the curtain. To Reyes and others like him, Coulson was a ghost, a legend, and a terrifying presence. Even low-level operatives rarely laid eyes on Coulson, but his influence permeated everything. All orders, Reyes revealed, emanated from the top down, often passed through several layers of intermediaries to protect the leader's identity, but for all his anonymity, Coulson's iron grip over the network was evident in its brutal efficiency. Reyes described Coulson as unforgiving and obsessed with control. He had eyes everywhere, and those who failed him paid the ultimate price. Reyes's testimony placed Coulson firmly in the crosshairs of law enforcement, solidifying him as the Shadow Network's mastermind. For the first time, agents had a clear understanding of how the group operated, decentralized to prevent a single takedown, but operating under the control of an individual who ran the organization with military precision. The beginning of the end. Reyes's cooperation gave federal investigators their first actionable intelligence against the Shadow Network, allowing them to identify meeting points, associates, and supply chains. However, this leak also came at a cost. Reyes's defection didn't go unnoticed. Members of the Shadow Network soon realized something was amiss when operations and hideouts began falling under scrutiny. Retribution was swift. Reyes had to be placed under federal protection, as rumors circulated that a team of Coulson's trusted enforcers had been dispatched to kill the traitor. For the FBI, this was the beginning of a long and dangerous game. They knew that the Shadow Network wouldn't crumble overnight. Reyes's betrayal may have opened the first crack in the organization's armor, but it also made the group even more paranoid, more ruthless, and more determined to silence anyone threatening their secrecy. Yet for all the risks, the leak marked a turning point. For years, the Shadow Network had thrived in absolute darkness. Now, for the first time, a sliver of light was beginning to illuminate the monstrous operation they had built. The fall of the Shadow Network in 2000. By the dawn of the new millennium, the Shadow Network's reign of terror was slowly closing in on its end. For years, this elusive group had wreaked havoc across the western United States, leaving behind an extensive path of destruction, fear, and death. But as federal agencies tightened their grip around the organization, carefully dismantling piece after piece, one truth became evident. The fall of the Shadow Network was not going to be clean or quiet. It would be violent, chaotic, and shrouded in the very terror that had defined the group since its inception. At the heart of this criminal empire was Michael Coulson, the ex-Marine turned mastermind, who had managed to elude capture for half a decade. His leadership was as meticulous as it was brutal, a combination that made his group nearly invincible. But law enforcement, armed with intelligence gathered through leaks and arrests, was finally ready to take the fight straight to Coulson and his inner circle. A last sanctuary, the Vegas hideout. On an uncharacteristically cold night in February 2000, a series of events began to unfold in the busy streets of Las Vegas, Nevada. Known for its glittering casinos, non-stop entertainment, and its reputation as a playground for anonymity, Vegas had served as the final hideout for Michael Coulson and his closest operatives. It wasn't random. Las Vegas's chaotic energy and transience provided the ideal cover for the Shadow Network's movements. Federal agents working alongside the Nevada police had spent weeks quietly tracking reports of suspicious financial activity tied to Las Vegas charter services, pawn shops, and a flurry of rentals in the industrial corners of the city. Finally, a credible lead surfaced. Reports of large cash drops, and the sudden appearance of armed men near an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. What Coulson and his group thought was their safe zone had, in truth, turned into the site of their final stand. The FBI and SWAT teams coordinated to move quickly, aware of the resourcefulness of the individuals they were about to face. But if law enforcement expected the operation to end swiftly, they were gravely mistaken. The battle in the warehouse. In the early hours of February 17, 2000, the operation to arrest Michael Coulson and dismantle the Shadow Network's last stronghold began. A tactical team swept into position outside the warehouse, armed and ready. Negotiators made the first move, attempting to draw members of the gang out by creating diversionary noises and moving lights across the grounds. There was no response. Inside, Coulson and his crew had fortified the warehouse like a small fortress. They had the advantage: automatic weapons, night vision goggles, hidden passageways, and years of experience. Coulson, as cunning as ever, prepared his men for a fight he likely knew they couldn't win. The first gunshots erupted just after 1 a.m. What should have been a stealth entry quickly devolved into an all-out gunfight. Explosions echoed through the industrial district as grenades detonated and flashbangs lit up the night sky. Law enforcement officers faced relentless firepower from the heavily armed fugitives who seemed determined to take as many lives as possible before being apprehended. One moment during the standoff sent chills down even the most seasoned officers' spines. Reports came in that Michael Colson himself had taken to a rooftop vantage point, wielding a sniper rifle and methodically targeting the federal vehicles outside. He wasn't an erratic shooter. Each bullet felt deliberate, in line with the precision and control he'd exhibited during years of orchestrating his criminal empire. But what Colson and his men didn't anticipate was the unyielding coordination of the federal forces. Over hours of tense combat, law enforcement began to gain the upper hand. They used thermal imaging to locate gang members hidden in the elaborate maze of warehouse structures. Tear gas was eventually deployed, forcing several Shadow Network members to surrender. Colson, however, refused to come quietly. The final capture. As dawn broke over the desert horizon, Michael Colson made his last stand. With most of his inner circle either dead or captured, he retreated to a reinforced section of the warehouse, an area stocked with enough ammunition to hold off a small army. Negotiators once again attempted to coax him out, but Colson responded only with bursts of gunfire. It wasn't until a carefully planned SWAT maneuver allowed officers to breach his hiding spot that the infamous leader was finally subdued. Even then, it was no simple arrest. Colson resisted until the very last moment, reportedly shouting an unsettling mix of militant rhetoric and death threats. After a physical confrontation, law enforcement managed to bring him down without taking further lives. The capture of Michael Colson marked the end of an era. Following the raid, investigators uncovered a trove of evidence within the warehouse: automatic weapons, high-powered sniper rifles, counterfeit money, and detailed plans for future attacks. These items and documents painted a chilling picture of a leadership that had been planning to expand its operations, potentially targeting public institutions and infrastructure on a massive scale. The aftermath. The immediate aftermath of the Las Vegas raid brought a wave of relief across the western United States. Michael Colson's capture was hailed as an enormous victory for law enforcement, a testament to years of relentless investigation and dedication to tracking down the nation's most wanted criminal network. For the victims' families, however, the relief was bittersweet. The Shadow Network had left behind a trail of senseless violence, families torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and a public trust shattered. The sheer scope of the devastation became clear as prosecutors began unraveling the gang's history in court. By the time the charges were laid out, Michael Colson was connected to more than 30 murders, multiple armed robberies, and countless other federal crimes. Over the course of several months, his network crumbled. Arrests were made across the country as former members of the Shadow Network were tracked down and brought to justice. While many of these arrests led to long prison sentences, others ended tragically. Gang members who refused to go down without a fight engaged law enforcement in smaller-scale yet equally violent confrontations. Colson himself faced trial in a federal courtroom in late 2000. His cold demeanor during proceedings shocked even the most hardened reporters and prosecutors. He showed no remorse, describing his actions as part of a larger mission, though he never specified exactly what he meant by that. Convicted on all counts, Colson was handed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. To this day, he spends his life in a maximum security federal prison, a shadow of the man who once commanded one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in modern American history. A legacy of fear and hard lessons learned. The fall of the Shadow Network was a turning point, but the scars they left behind lingered. From 1995 to 2000, the group's reign resulted in over 30 major crimes and at least 27 confirmed deaths, including civilians and law enforcement officers. The psychological toll of their coordinated terror, their militaristic tactics, and their ruthless efficiency reshaped how federal and local agencies approached organized crime. The Shadow Network's story remains a cautionary tale, a brutal reminder of what happens when expertise and skill are twisted into vehicles for violence. For law enforcement, their downfall became a case study in the importance of interagency collaboration, resource allocation, and the need to monitor disillusioned individuals with dangerous skills. And for the American public, the fear they inspired lingers as an unforgettable chapter in modern criminal history. The story of a network of shadows and the dogged determination to bring its darkness into the light. The aftermath and haunting lessons of the Shadow Network. The takedown of the Shadow Network in 2000 marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in modern American criminal history, but the void left behind by their terror wasn't filled so easily. The fallout from 5 years of unspeakable crimes, murders, kidnappings, ambushes, and sophisticated robberies left an indelible scar on the United States. Public faith in the safety of everyday life was shaken, as was confidence in law enforcement's ability to predict and prevent such calculated violence. For the families of the victims, there was no true sense of closure. Courtroom convictions and life sentences couldn't bring back the innocent lives lost during the Shadow Network's reign. Neither could it erase the years of fear, uncertainty, and devastating personal loss. And for law enforcement and policymakers, the Shadow Network became a grim reminder of what happens when expertise, trust, and skill are corrupted into tools of chaos. Devastation by the numbers. Between 1995 and 2000, the Shadow Network left a bloody legacy. More than 30 cities across the western United States were affected by their coordinated attacks. At least 27 deaths were directly tied to their operations, a horrifying mix of civilians, business owners, innocent families, and law enforcement officers. Among those casualties were children, caught in the indiscriminate web of violence spun by Michael Colson and his operatives. The final reports listed hundreds of burglaries, dozens of violent assaults, and millions of dollars in stolen goods and property damage. Entire communities were left paralyzed in their wake. Small roadside towns that once thrived on cross-country travelers saw their motel and convenience store businesses dry up, as fear prevented travelers from stopping for the night. Interstate highways like I-5, formerly bustling main thoroughfares connecting major cities, became synonymous with danger after a rash of disappearances and murders targeting road trippers and truck drivers alike. Who could forget the haunting headlines about families that vanished during holiday travels, only for their burned-out vehicles to later be discovered in the forest? The effects rippled far beyond the immediate crime scenes and victims, infecting the national psyche with paranoia and distrust. But the devastation wasn't just physical or financial, it was psychological. The audacity and militaristic precision of the Shadow Network inspired fear unparalleled by your average criminal. These weren't low-level street gangs or opportunistic robbers, they were disciplined, trained, and terrifyingly methodical. The notion that someone knocking on your door in uniform could be a predator rather than a protector took root in the public consciousness, damaging perceptions of safety and trust in first responders. The families left behind. For those who lost loved ones, the fall of the Shadow Network did little to repair shattered lives. Parents mourned children taken from them during seemingly routine drives along quiet highways. Widows grew old without partners, haunted by memories of quiet nights interrupted by the cruel violence that claimed their families. Survivors spoke of sleepless nights, afraid that even with Colson behind bars, danger would always lurk just out of sight. Grief turned into activism among some of the families affected. One notable example came from the widow of Officer Greg Dawson, a Denver police officer who had been killed in the infamous Denver ambush of 1998. Melissa Dawson founded an organization dedicated to supporting families of fallen officers and advocating for better training and collaboration between local law enforcement and federal agencies. Greg believed in justice, Melissa said in a televised interview. We can't bring him back, but we can use his story to make sure no family goes through this kind of pain again. Similarly, parents of young victims formed grassroots efforts to push for stricter control over online firearms purchases and better tracking systems for military-grade equipment sold on the commercial market. Their activism highlighted an issue law enforcement had struggled with during the investigation. Many of the tools used by the Shadow Network could be purchased legally and anonymously, despite their deadly potential. A crisis in confidence. The Shadow Network's use of impersonation, posing as cops, utility workers, or seemingly harmless roadside helpers, left a lasting impact on how communities viewed authority. The fear of being tricked or betrayed by someone in uniform began to alter everyday behavior. Neighborhood watch programs across the country sprung up practically overnight following media coverage of the group's violent operations. Residents became hyper-skeptical of strangers, and a rush of personal security purchases, such as home surveillance systems and firearms, was reported in the years immediately following Coulson's capture. Perhaps nowhere was the crisis of confidence more evident than in law enforcement itself. The shadow network had successfully exploited not only the physical gaps within jurisdictions, but also bureaucratic inefficiencies. Separate police departments, unaware of each other's cases or unwilling to share information, had inadvertently allowed the group to operate with impunity for years. This failure sparked an overhaul of how local police and federal agencies communicated about organized crime. New protocols, databases, and interagency task forces were created to ensure that no similar organization could ever slip through the cracks again. Lessons from the shadows. The shadow network also forced a deeper reckoning with how military-trained individuals reintegrated into civilian society. While most veterans transitioned successfully into new roles, Coulson's path from decorated Marine to ruthless criminal shone a light on the vulnerabilities some individuals face after discharge. Coulson's personal grievances, fueled by frustration with authority and a perceived lack of respect for his skills, created a perfect storm for radicalization. His leadership attracted other disillusioned veterans, particularly those with unresolved anger or trauma, turning highly trained individuals into lethal tools of destruction. The fallout prompted conversations about the needs of re-entering service members. Services like mental health counseling, job placement programs specifically tailored for military skill sets, and monitoring for signs of radicalized behavior saw increased attention in the years following Coulson's capture. Still, for every policy discussion spurred by the shadow network's impact, the lingering question remains: how long does it take to repair the cracks in trust left by an organization so uniquely destructive? The role of technology and systemic weaknesses. Another chilling aspect of the shadow network's operations was its exploitation of gaps in technology and systemic oversight. Their use of throwaway phones, encrypted communications, and untraceable tools showcased how criminals could outpace even some of the best surveillance efforts in their time. Coulson's group constantly adapted to law enforcement techniques, staying one step ahead, a cat-and-mouse game with deadly stakes. In response, law enforcement began to rethink its approach to technology. Investments into cybercrime and forensic digital analysis skyrocketed in the early 2000s. The shadow network solidified the idea that crime in the modern world couldn't be fought without keeping up with constantly evolving technology. A somber reminder for future generations. Today, the shadow network stands as a grim reminder of how dangerous a criminal organization can become when skill, training, and ruthlessness are paired with a willingness to exploit the cracks in society. For historians, sociologists, and law enforcement experts, the story of Michael Coulson is not just one of bad luck, bad timing, or random individuals gone rogue. It's a testament to how thin the line between order and chaos can truly be. The lessons learned, better communication between agencies, increased scrutiny on military surplus sales, and more robust support for vulnerable individuals have undoubtedly made a difference. But the scars left by the shadow network are slow to heal. For the families of the victims, the fear they created and the absence they left will always remain. The shadow network's demise serves as both a victory and a warning. Even in the safest of nations, the most professional and coordinated dark forces can emerge when power, betrayal, and despair collide. It is only through vigilance, collaboration, and relentless pursuit of justice that such shadows can ever be extinguished.